Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This one is the bottom floor and going down. And typically, if you've seen this show, what we do is we randomly select a card from scryfall.com. We work with a budget of $100 or less and build a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. This week though, little bit different. Instead of a random card, we actually have one that was suggested to us on Reddit by a user named dualdreamer, and this specific card is Necroskitter. So it's 1 black for a 1/4 elemental with Wither, and it says whenever a creature an opponent controls with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you may return that card to the battlefield under your control. So initially, when I was going through this deck and I had thought about making it, I wanted to use Hapatra, but I made the decision that Golgari -1/-1 counters seemed a little bit too easy, and so I wanted something just slightly more difficult. So instead we went Rakdos, and we decided on the Scorpion God, who is my personal favorite god from Hour of Devastation, who doesn't get a lot of love. He is 3 black-red for a 6/5 legendary creature, god. Whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, we draw a card. We can pay 3 mana to put a -1/-1 counter on another target creature, and whenever it dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So we want to be putting counters on our opponent's creatures that in some way benefits us. So Necroskitter would let us gain control of those creatures, Scorpion God lets us draw cards. There are plenty of ways for us to benefit from it in these colors, and specifically in this deck. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of our themes. Obviously, the first one is going to be -1/-1 counters, represented here by Soul Snuffers, 2 black for an elemental shaman. It's a 3/3, and when it comes into play, we put a -1/-1 counter on each creature. That does include Ards, but Scorpion God doesn't really care if the -1/-1 counters are on our things or our opponent's things, so Soul Snuffers, very good in that context. Our second major theme are getting some sort of benefit for our opponent's creatures having counters on them. Or, in some cases, like Kulrath Knight, giving our opponents the downside of having these counters. So Kulrath Knight is a 5 mana 3/3 elemental knight with flying and wither, so it deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, which is also a bit of a minor sub-theme in this deck. We want our creatures to put counters on things. And it says that creatures our opponents control with counters on them can't attack or block. Now that does include all counters. So if our opponents are a +1/+1 counter deck, that still shuts down their attacking and blocking. So Kulrath Knight, very powerful, very useful. Definitely makes a good include for this deck, and shows off what we're really trying to do with our counters. And our final theme is going to be Discard, which we have represented by Chainer, Nightmare Adept, 2 black-red for a legendary creature, human minion, 3/2. We can discard a card, and we may cast a creature spell from our graveyard this turn, but we can activate that only once each turn. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, if we didn't cast it from our hand, it gains haste until the next turn. So being able to discard some of our spells and get a lot more value out of it, being able to draw cards by discarding cards or reanimate creatures out of the graveyard, means that we don't really care if our creatures die, especially if we're putting a bunch of -1/-1 counters on everything. So this is just a great way of making sure that if our stuff dies, we can reanimate it, we can throw our own things away, and it's just a good value engine overall. But other than the themes, we do of course have some key cards in the deck, some things that we really want to get into play. The first of which is Black Sun's Zenith, X black for a sorcery. We put X -1/-1 counters on each creature, and then we shuffle Black Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So this allows us to put a ton of counters on each creature on the board, which if we have something like Necroskitter or we have something like the Scorpion God, we're able to draw a bunch of cards, gain control of a bunch of creatures, and it's a phenomenal way to wipe the board, but also give us a ton of advantage at the same time. Our next key card is Liliana Deathwielder, which is actually a Planeswalker deck Planeswalker. She is 5 black for a Planeswalker, Liliana. She comes in at 5 loyalty, And we can +2 to put a -1/-1 counter on up to one target creature, -3 to destroy target creature with a -1/-1 counter, or -10 to return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. That last ability, probably not going to get used very often, but being able to put counters on things each turn or destroy things with counters on them is incredibly useful in this deck. And even though it's 7 mana, it's usually not too much of an issue to get up to 7 mana to be able to cast her. And if we can play this maybe after like a Black Sun Zenith, play her into an empty board and get tons of value from her. And then finally, our last card, Corrosive Mentor, 2 and a black for a 1/3 elemental rogue that says black creatures you control have Wither. So that way all of our creatures, all the ones that are black at least, do damage in the form of -1/-1 counters. So our opponents can choose to either take the damage or have their creatures get -1/-1 counters, meaning that all of our abilities start to activate. We turn on our Necroskitter and our Scorpion God and all these different things that want our opponent's creatures to have -1/-1 counters. So this makes attacking, blocking incredibly difficult for our opponents and pretty much always puts us in a good spot when it comes to combat. So with our themes and our key cards out of the way, I do want to take a look at some cool interactions, some things in this deck that I think are pretty neat and pretty useful. The first of which is Merciless Javelineer and Archfiend of Ifnir. So Merciless Javelineer, 2 black/red for a creature Minotaur Warrior, 4/2. We can pay 2 mana to discard a card and put a -1/-1 counter on target creature, and that creature can't block this turn. And if we combine that with the Archfiend of Ifnir, which is 3 black/black for a 5/4 flying demon, whenever you cycle or discard another card, we put a -1/-1 counter on each creature our opponents control, and it has cycling for 2. So that discard synergy we talked about earlier really comes into play here. With Merciless Javelineer on the field, it becomes pay 2 mana, discard a card, put one -1/-1 counter on a creature, and then put a -1/-1 counter on each creature our opponents control with Archfiend of Ifnir. So this becomes incredibly powerful. It's a pseudo board wipe if we can discard enough cards, and it's a great combat trick because we can do it at instant speed. So this is an awesome combination if we're ever able to get it onto the battlefield. And our next cool interaction is between Puncture Blast and Sudden Spoiling. So Puncture Blast is 2 and a red, instant with Wither, so just like our creatures, doing damage in the form of -1/-1 counters. And it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. And then Sudden Spoiling is 1 black/black, instant with Split Second, so as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. And until the end of turn, creatures target player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 0/2. So this is a great way to help us survive a massive attack, but it's also a good way to put some -1/-1 counters on our opponent's creatures with a Puncture Blast, and then turn them into 0/2s, which means we can immediately kill even the biggest threat on the board relatively easily. And if other things have counters on them, more than one thing could die. So both of these cards are very, very useful in this deck. And so, with our cool interactions out of the way, let's take a quick look at the price of this deck, which came pretty close to our budget, $96.05, with the most expensive card actually being Necroskitter, our chosen card of the week. And obviously, since that is the card that this deck is built around, we can't really cut it. But we do have a couple of cards that are very expensive. Black Sun Zenith is about $8 as well. Liliana is about $6. So there are some high-end cards that you can definitely cut if you're looking to trim down the price a little bit. There are tons of other -1/-1 counter synergies in the Rakdos colors that you can throw in if you're looking to decrease the budget even more. But obviously, Necroskitter being the card of the week, we definitely can't cut it. And so, now that we've taken a look at the deck, we have gone through the cool interactions and the themes and the key cards. The last thing we got to do is test out this deck in an actual game. So we are going to run this deck up against Admiral Beckett Brass, being played by Shawn, Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, being played by Jason, and Sephris of the Hidden Ways, being played by Bilal. So Admiral Beckett Brass is definitely a pirate tribal deck. I haven't seen this particular deck from Shawn before, so I'm interested to see how it plays. But I would imagine it's going to involve a bunch of pirates hitting the board and swinging pretty hard pretty quickly. Liesa is a life gain strategy from Jason. He tries to tax his opponents, make sure that he can gain life while the rest of us can't, and generally just punish his opponents for playing their spells. And then Bilal's Sephiroth deck is actually a Reanimator style deck. He wants to discard some massive creatures and then return them to the battlefield, also getting some use out of Sephiroth along the way. And really quickly, before we do jump into the game, I would like to point out that playing this game, we all completely misunderstood how Sephiroth works. The venturing into the dungeon ability triggers only once each turn. We did not realize that playing the game, so unfortunately there are quite a few mistakes when it comes to Sephiroth, but that is on all of us. None of us noticed it, and overall I don't think it necessarily changed too much, but it is something to point out. So with that being said, we will jump into the game. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I will talk to you once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and Bilal. On my turn, I play a Baron Moor. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Wayfarer's Bauble. Jason plays a Plains and casts Speaker of the Heavens. Bilal plays a Thriving Heath, naming blue, so it taps for blue and white. I play a Mountain and cast Ruthless Sniper, which can put a -1/-1 counter on target creature when I discard a card and pay 1 mana. Shawn plays an Island and then sacrifices Wayfarer's Bauble to put a Swamp into play tapped. On Jason's turn, he plays an Esper Panorama and then attacks Bilal for 1, gaining 1 thanks to lifelink, and then sacrifices Esper Panorama to put a Swamp into play. On Bilal's turn, he reveals a Swamp so that his Sunken Hollow comes into play untapped. On my turn, I play a Swamp and cast Rakdos Locket before attacking Shawn for 1. On Shawn's turn, he plays an Island and then casts Lightning Rig Crew, which can tap to do 1 damage to each opponent and untap whenever he casts a pirate, and then he casts Siren Stormtamer. Jason plays a Godless Shrine tapped, and then attacks me for 1, gaining 1 when it hits. Bilal plays a Concealed Courtyard and casts his commander, Sephiroth of the Hidden Ways, allowing him to venture into the dungeon once a turn when his creature dies. I play a Desert of the Glorified and then cast Needle Spectre, which has Wither and forces my opponents to discard a card whenever it does combat damage. Shawn activates Lightning Rig Crew, doing 1 to each opponent, and then casts Azure Fleet Admiral, becoming the Monarch and untapping the Lightning Rig Crew. He then attacks Jason for 1, and at the end of turn, he draws a card for being the Monarch. Jason, unfortunately, misses his 4th land drop and passes. Bilal plays Gaia Reach Sanitarium and activates it, having each player draw and discard a card. This lets me pay 1 when I discard to put a -1/-1 counter on Siren Stormtamer. And then Bilal casts Reanimate, paying 7 life to put the Defiant Bloodlord that Jason just discarded into play under his control. I play If Near Deadlands, and then attack Shawn for 1, becoming the Monarch and forcing him to discard a card. And in my second main phase, I cast Liliana's Influence, putting a -1/-1 counter on each creature my opponents control, and searching my deck for Liliana, Death Wielder, putting her to hand. Shawn casts a Rakdos Signet, and then activates Lightning Rig Crew, doing 1 to each opponent, before casting Coastline Marauders, which gets +1/+0 when it attacks for each land defending player controls, which untaps the Lightning Rig Crew. He then attacks me for 3 unblockable damage with the Azure Fleet Admiral, becoming the Monarch and drawing for it at the end of turn. Jason plays a Vault of Champions and then casts a Well of Lost Dreams so he can pay mana to draw cards every time he gains life. Bilal plays an Island and then activates Gaia Reach Sanitarium to have everyone draw and discard. This has Bilal discarding a creature and venturing into the dungeon of the Mad Mage thanks to Sephrus. That has him gaining 1 life, but unfortunately we missed the Bloodlord trigger from this as well. On my turn, I cast the Scorpion God, allowing me to draw a card whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies. I play an Ash Barrens, and then attack Shawn for 1, taking back the Monarchy and making him discard a card. Then, at the end of turn, I draw a card for being the Monarch, and Shawn activates Lightning Rig Crew to do 1 damage to each opponent. On Shawn's turn, he casts a Soul Ring, followed up by a Molten Echoes naming Pirates. This makes him a token copy of each pirate he casts, but with haste, and it gets exiled at the end of turn. He then casts Stormfleet Aerialist, making a copy of it, and on the stack he activates Lightning Rig Crew, doing 1 to everyone and then untapping it. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 3 with the Admiral, reclaiming the Monarchy, and drawing for it at the end of turn. Jason plays a Tainted Field, and casts his commander Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, which makes everyone lose 2 life when they cast a spell. Bilal plays a Swamp, and then activates Gaia Reach Sanitarium, having everyone draw and discard. When I discard, I pay 1 to put a -1/-1 counter on Liesa, and Bilal then casts Necromancy, returning the Sire of Stagnation into play. On my turn, I play a Swamp, exiling the top 2 cards of my deck and having Bilal draw 2 thanks to the Sire of Stagnation. And then I cast a Nest of Scarabs, giving me a 1/1 insect token whenever a -1/-1 counter is placed on a creature, and I lose 2 life from Liesa. I then cast Incremental Blight, putting a -1/-1 counter on Stormfleet Aerialist, 2 counters on Coastline Marauders, and 3 counters on Sire of Stagnation. This gives me 6 insects from Nest of Scarabs, and loses me 2 life from Liesa. I then attack Shawn for 1, but he blocks with a Stormfleet Aerialist, killing the pirate, and drawing me a card with the Scorpion God. At the end of turn, Shawn activates his crew to do 1 damage to each opponent. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Swamp, triggering the Sire of Stagnation, and then casts a Deadeye Plunderer, tapping the Lightning Rig Crew in response, then untapping it and copying the Plunderer. He then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 5 with the copy, and Bilal blocks with the Sire of Stagnation, killing it, venturing into the dungeon, and scrying 1. On Jason's turn, he attacks Shawn for 4 with Liesa, gaining 4 life when she hits and becoming the Monarch. He also pays 1 mana into Well of Lost Dreams to draw a card. In his second main phase, he casts Day of Judgment to destroy all creatures. In response, Shawn activates Lightning Rig Crew, doing 1 to each opponent, and then I draw 6 from the Scorpion God, and Bilal ventures into the dungeon, creating a treasure token. Then at the end of turn, Jason draws for Monarchy, and I return the Scorpion God from my graveyard to my hand. On Bilal's turn, he casts a Commander Sphere, followed up by a Solemn Simulacrum, putting a basic land into play from his library. On my turn, I play a Mountain, and then cast Liliana Deathwielder. I activate her +2 ability to put a -1/-1 counter on Solemn Simulacrum, making an insect token. And then I cast a Festering Mummy. On Shawn's turn, he encores Coastline Marauders, making 3 copies of it, casts a Prying Blade, and then attacks each opponent with a copy of the Marauders, sending 8 at me, 5 at Jason, and 4 at Bilal, which should have been 8, but unfortunately we miscounted. I block with an insect, Bilal blocks with Solemn Simulacrum, drawing a card when it dies, and then Shawn becomes the Monarch. At the end of turn, Shawn draws for Monarchy and exiles his copies of Coastline Marauder. Jason plays a Swamp and casts Talisman of Hierarchy, followed up by a Divinity of Pride. Bilal plays a Dimir Aqueduct, bouncing an island to his hand, but taps it for mana first. He then casts Dakhan Shadowslayer, coming in with 8 loyalty, and recasts his commander Sephrus, before activating Dakhan's +2 ability to Surveil 2. At the end of turn, Bilal discards to hand size, discarding a creature, which lets him venture into the dungeon and scry 2. On my turn, I play a Mountain and activate Liliana's +2 ability to put a -1/-1 counter on Divinity of Pride, making an insect. And then I cast Kulrath Knight, making it so my opponent's creatures with counters can't attack or block. I then attack Shawn for 1, taking back the Monarchy. In my second main phase, I recast the Scorpion God, and at the end of turn, I draw for being the Monarch. Shawn plays a Mountain, and then casts a Coercive Recruiter, making a copy of it with Molten Echoes. This allows him to take control of Kulrath Knight and Divinity of Pride. He follows that up by casting Captain Vargas Wrath, which makes another copy of it, but it dies to the Legend rule, and this triggers the Coercive Recruiters again, stealing the Scorpion God and Sephrus. Finally, he casts Warkite Marauder, copying it again, and stealing Festering Mummy and the Insect token. This allows him to go to combat, attacking me for 15, knocking me out of the game, and Bilal for 11. This also gives Shawn 7 life from the Divinity of Pride, and gives him the Monarchy, which he draws for at the end of turn. On Jason's turn, he attacks Shawn for 7, gaining 7 life and becoming Monarch. And in his second main phase, he casts Tragic Arrogance to destroy his own Talisman of Hierarchy, Shawn's Captain Vargas, Coercive Recruiter, Rakdos Signet, and Soul Ring. Bilal casts an Ingenious Mastery, drawing 3 cards and having Jason make 2 treasures as well as scry 2. He then casts a Cloud Blazer, gaining 2 life and drawing 2 cards, and activates Dakon's +2 ability to Surveil 2, putting a creature into the graveyard, venturing into the dungeon and making 2 skeleton tokens. He then casts a Baleful Strix, drawing another card, and when Bilal goes to discard, he discards a creature to hand size, venturing into the dungeon and scrying 3. This shouldn't have happened since Sephrus only triggers once a turn, but we don't catch this mistake at the time. On Shawn's turn, he casts a Curious Obsession on Warkite Marauder, letting it draw a card when it deals damage to an opponent, and then equips it with Prying Blade, giving it +1/+0 and making a treasure token when it hits an opponent. He then attacks Jason for 4, drawing a card, making a treasure, and becoming Monarch. In his second main phase, he casts Dire Fleet Captain, drawing for Monarch at the end of turn. Jason plays a Swamp, and then recasts Liesa, paying 2 life instead of the commander tax, and then attacks Shawn for 7, gaining 7, and reclaiming the Monarchy again. In his second main phase, he casts Kambal, Console of Allocation, so whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, they lose 2 life and Jason gains 2 life, and he loses 2 life from Liesa casting the spell, and then also draws for Monarch at the end of turn. Bilal plays an Island, and then activates Dakon's +2 to Surveil 2. He then taps Commander Sphere, floating a black mana, and sacrificing it to draw a card. Bilal then casts a Karmic Guide, losing 2 life, and returning Lorcan Warlock Collector to play. On Shawn's turn, he casts Admiral Beckett Brass, losing 2 life, copying it and returning the original to the command zone with the Legend rule. He then attacks Jason with everything for 15 damage. On the attacks, Warkite Marauder turns Liesa into a 0/1 with no abilities, but before the damage, Jason casts a Despark to exile the copy of Admiral Beckett Brass, taking 11 total damage. Shawn also draws a card, makes a treasure, and becomes the Monarch again. In his second main phase, he plays a Mountain, followed up by casting a Commander Sphere, which he immediately sacrifices to draw a card. Then at the end of turn, he draws another card for being the Monarch. Jason casts a Sanguine Bond, so whenever he gains life, target opponent loses that much life, and he loses 2 life from Liesa. He then attacks Shawn for 8, gaining 8 life and doing an additional 8 damage to Shawn, and becomes the Monarch. In his second main phase, he casts a Ghostly Prison to make his opponents pay 2 mana for each creature that attacks him, and then draws at the end of turn for Monarch. Bilal doesn't pay Karmic Guide's Echo cost, sacrificing it and venturing into the dungeon, completing it, and returning Karmic Guide to play with Sephiroth's ability. Karmic Guide then brings back Sire of Stagnation, and this also lets him draw the top 3 cards of his deck and cast a Revelark for free. When the Revelark enters, it returns a Solemn Simulacrum into play, which puts a basic land into play from his library. He then plays a Command Tower, before casting a Disciple of Bolas, sacrificing Lorcan to gain 6 life and draw 6 cards. He then ventures into the Dungeon of the Mad Mage again, gaining another life, before casting a Plague Crafter, making each player sacrifice a creature and venturing into the dungeon again, scrying 1. He then casts Persist, returning Plague Crafter into play, making each player sacrifice a creature again, and venturing into the dungeon. This lets him create a treasure token. He then activates Dakon's +2 ability to Surveil 2. Bilal then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for exactly 5 damage, eliminating him from the game. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Despark to exile the Divinity of Pride. On Jason's turn, he recasts Liesa, paying 4 life instead of commander tax, and then casts a High Priest of Penance, allowing him to destroy any non-land permanent when it is dealt damage. On Bilal's turn, he activates Dakon's -3 ability to exile Liesa, and then casts Sir Conrad the Grim. This doesn't automatically win him the game, but Jason, not seeing a way to come back and win, decides to concede, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that game was tons of fun. We got to show off some incredibly powerful stuff with our Rakdos counters deck. Unfortunately, eliminated pretty early, and it's especially sad because that turn that Shawn went off and attacked us with a bunch of pirates, if I hadn't cast the Scorpion God, we did have sudden spoiling in our hand, so we could have survived another turn, possibly done some more fun stuff after that, so that's definitely a punt on my end, but overall, I think most of the decks showed that they are very powerful and very terrifying in the right position. Like I mentioned before, Sephiroth, unfortunately, we didn't quite catch that the ability triggers only once each turn, so that probably affected the outcome, but I don't think it affected it too much, and I think the game was still very fun, and even with that ability, Sephiroth still didn't feel very broken, so I do think that it's not necessarily a bad thing. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, I hope you guys enjoyed the game, the deck tech. If you have any suggestions for future videos or for future deck techs, please do let me know. I'm always happy to take those suggestions and hopefully turn them into some decks. And while you're at it, if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel, I would really appreciate it. It definitely helps us grow. We're trying to get there, so a wider audience is always nice. But you're also always welcome to follow me over on Twitter. That is in the description, or just send me an email, also in the description, or just comment if you have any suggestions for, like I said, future videos or ways to improve the channel. So please do let me know. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you had a good time, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.